Welcome back. If you're just joining us, pause the video here and check out parts 1 and 2. I'll include a YouTube info card at the top and the URLs in the description below. For everybody else, let's dive right in. In this segment, we're going to key in some additional movement, create some obstacles, add a muzzle flash for our blaster, as well as some sound and animations. Let's get started. First thing we want to do is come over here to the cube, and I want to hit M on the keyboard and then add a new collection. We're going to call this collection crate. The reason that we do that is so that we can easily hide our light and camera until we need them. Next thing I want to do is hit N on the keyboard, and then we want to left click and hold and scroll down to select all three, changing the size to 12 inches at the same time. Hit N to collapse that side menu, and then hit the numpad period to zoom into your cube. Tab into edit mode, and then we want to hit I to inset. You may have to hit I twice. Once you see the individual faces, just bring those down until you have what appears to be a nice looking frame size. Then we want to hit Alt and E to extrude faces along normals, and we want to bring those in so that your frame has nice sidewall. With everything still selected, hit P to parent by selection, and then tab out of edit mode. We're going to rename this first object as frame, and then we can hide that for the moment. We don't need to see it. We're going to work on the sidewalls. Hit Shift and A, add a new cube, and then hit Enter on the keyboard, and let's scale this down until it just overlaps our cube, and then we want to parent that by selection. Okay, now we have that. Tab out of edit mode. Make sure that you are selecting on cube.002. Rename that to sideboards. And then cube 001, we no longer need that one. With this one, let's tab into edit mode, select everything, Control and R. We want to add a few loop cuts so that you have 4 vertical lines, and then hit Enter twice on the keyboard. Now for this individual panel over here, we have to do these 2 sidewalls individually. We want to, for edge select, we want to select the top and bottom edge, and then I'm going to very quickly move my screencast keys over slightly and then collapse that. So what we want to do is right click and subdivide, and we want to bring up this little menu here. We want 4 cuts so that it matches the other wall. We're going to do the same thing on this other side. Right click, subdivide, same thing. We want 4 cuts, and then you can deselect that. So that very quickly gives us the individual sideboards that we will need. Hit I on the keyboard, and let's just make sure that the individual panels have a little bit of separation, and then we're going to press Alt E and extrude the individual faces, bringing those out ever so slightly. And then we're going to, while everything's still selected, press the Control plus and then parent this by selection. Then we have sideboards 1 and 2. Sideboards we no longer need because that's the frame, and now we have our individual boards. So let's go ahead and delete the sideboards. So now we only have the frame and the sideboards with our individual panels. Next, what I want to do is come back in. I just want one of these boards, so I'm just going to select L with the mouse hovered over one of them. I want to press Shift and D and Enter, and then parent that by selection. I want to rename this board as Crossboard. I also want to press 3 on my numpad, GY. Let's bring that in so it's center or close to center. Let's go ahead and come up to Object, set the origin to the center of the mask, and then R, X, and we can bring this in, and then SZZ, and then bring that out. Okay, and then I'm going to bring this out slightly, so GX, and just bring this out. I want it to be inside the frame, and I also want to make sure that I don't have any overlap on the inside. So I'm going to scale this on X as well. Let's toggle on X-ray mode and then tab into edit mode. We can zoom in a little bit more. We want to be able to see these top edges. Make sure that you've got 2 on the keyboard for edge select, and then we want to select these top 2 edges, right click and subdivide. That's going to give us this line in the middle. Then hit 3 on the keyboard again so we can see, and we want to hit GZZ and notice the blue line in the direction of the board. Then once you have that where you want it, hit enter. Let's do the same thing on the bottom side. So grab those 2 edges, subdivide, select that top edge, and then GZZ and bring that in. So once we have that where we want it, tab back out of edit mode, and then you can hit SZZ. Again, same thing. You want the blue line to be in the direction of the board, and then hit enter on that. So once you have that, now we have the crossboard without fear of it bleeding out the side edges, but still having good connection with our model. Let's come up here to viewport preview, and for the sideboards, they're selected here. We can add a material, and we're just going to call this brown. Find a nice light brown color. And for the frame and the crossboard, we can add a darker brown. So we can use this same color as a copy and then just darken that up. And then we'd probably want this crossboard to use the dark brown as well. Once we have this, we can Alt-D, and that'll give us a linked duplicate. And then we're just going to RX90, and that'll give us a nice crossboard. So for these 2, let's make sure that our object origin is back at the 3D cursor. Hopefully it didn't move that. And then we're going to press Alt-Z and then RZ180, and that's going to give us the crossboards on the opposite side. Now I want to do just one for these opposite sides, just so we have some variation. So Alt-D on that, and then RZ90. And then for this one, I can Alt-Z and then RZ180 for that opposite side. So then we have quick crossboards. For these 2, I probably want some good support on the bottom. So Alt-Z, RY90, and that's going to give us our bottom. And then for the top, because that's where we're going to open it and things might sit there, we don't really want any crossboards on that. So there's a nice quick crate for your project. Now what I want to do, because I may animate this later, is I'm just going to duplicate this entire collection. I'm going to call this crate backup, and then I'm going to hide it from the render and the viewport. And for this crate, what I want to do is select everything by holding Shift, and then I want to hit the Control key, and I want to select the frame last, so everything will join to that. So now come back over here, we're going to press Control and J, and now we just have the one object, and we're going to call this crate. So now that we have this crate, come up to File Export, and we want GLB, and then what we're going to do is just rename this as crate. Let's make sure that we tick this selected and rendered objects. We didn't add any modifiers. Our object is fairly low poly, but just in case, you can always apply modifiers here under the mesh. And then we didn't animate anything, so in this case, we're just going to export the GLB. Now back in our gDevelop project, we're going to click on Add a New Object. We're going to add a 3D model. Call this crate. Let's search for that file. Click on the crate that we imported into our scene, and then leaving the rest of this default. There were no animations, so just click Apply on that. I want to bring my crate into my scene, and the first thing that I notice is that our crate didn't have a crossbar on the top. We know that we had no crossboard. So for Blender to gDevelop, the X rotation is 270. We can see right away that fixes that rotation. We have no crossbar on the top. I also want to change the Z rotation to 45 just so we can see what that looks like. If we preview our scene, it looks like our crate is kind of large, but also we've never set the Z elevation on our camera. If you click here, we can see that it's still 0. So if I change that to 64, and I'll preview the scene again, we can see that looks a lot better. So what I want to do though, instead of having Z elevation on my camera, I want to set an event for that. And the event that I want to set is right here in the every frame. Add an action for the camera. We want the Z elevation and we want to set that to 64. Hit OK on that, preview our scene, and we can see that looks a lot nicer. So we can still walk through our crate because we haven't added a group for obstacles yet. Let's go ahead and do that now. Let's come back to our scene and we want to add a new group and we're just going to call this obstacles. Let's go into that and add our crate. Click apply on that. It's the only obstacle we have right now. And for that, we want to add a section for our camera to not go through that event. We've already done the work here. Let's copy this event, come down to the bottom. If you click here and then paste that, we'll come into close to the right area. Bring this down. And we can also, let's add a new event group and we're just going to call this obstacles. And then make sure that we have that nested. And if our camera is in collision with obstacles, let's make sure that our camera moves away from obstacles. So now if we go back into our scene and we walk, we cannot walk through the crate. Perfect. So next thing I want to do is allow my player to duck. So let's go ahead and click here on the floor setup, and then we want to come up and add a comment, and then nest that comment right here in the camera movement. We're just going to call this player duck. In order to allow our player to duck, we're going to add an event, and getting it close is fine. Nest that there. For the condition, we want key press. If the key is pressed and I want the space key, you can always change that to your personal preference. For the space key being pressed, let's add an action for the camera. Change the Z elevation, and we want to set the elevation to 0. And so if the space key is pressed, we're lowering the elevation from what was the 64 back down to 0. So then we need to add a second event. Just copy paste this and let's hit the J key to invert that. Let's set that value back to 64. So if the space key is not pressed, our player stays on the elevation of 64 on the Z. And if the space is pressed, let's test that now. So if we're coming in here, you can see that we can now duck down. And the reason I want to have that in my game is because I anticipate that our enemy will fire, our player will have to duck. So that is it for that section. In Blender, we're going to go ahead and delete the default cube and then press Shift and A. Let's add in a mesh UV sphere. Press Ctrl and 2 for quick subdivision. You can see that if you go to the modifier properties. Press RY90. That'll turn our model. You can see that when we tab into it. I also want to hit the N key on the keyboard and we can see that it's 2 meters, which is a large model. So let's go ahead, left click and hold while dragging the mouse wheel so that we can change all of these at the same time. I want to set mine to about 8 inches and then also apply that scale by pressing Ctrl A. Notice that the scale changes to 1 so we know that we won't have problems later. Go ahead and hit N to collapse that menu. And you can press the numpad period to zoom into your object. Right-click Shade Smooth, and let's tab into our model. We haven't applied the modifier yet, so this is still fairly easy to move. Press 1 on the keyboard and select this top vertex, and then press 1 on the numpad. Zoom out just a touch. Press O for proportional editing, and then we want to press G and X If you don't see a gray circle, roll the mouse wheel up to reduce the area of influence. So now if I start moving this, you'll see that all of the front vertices inside that gray circle are affected. So if I reduce that, it reduces the area. So I'm going to set mine there. Just left click the mouse when you're set. And I'm going to do the same thing in the back. I'm going to press 1 on the numpad so I can see what I'm doing. GX. And this time I really want to reduce the area of impact. So I'm just going to bring that back a touch. Once I've done that, I can go ahead and apply this modifier. Then let's add a new modifier. I want to add a displace. You'll have to zoom out just a touch. We can bring the strength down quite a bit. And right now mine's set at 0.1. I may change that later. Click here on new and let's go to the texture properties. Click here on type. I'm going to use clouds for mine. So you can play around with the size, which will change what that looks like. So I'm going to leave mine at 0.15. I like the way that looks. Now I'm going to go to the material properties. I'm going to add a new material and I'm just going to call this Muzzle Flash. I'm going to change the surface from a principled BSDF to an emission. I'm going to change the color to something in the yellow or orange range. Come up here to viewport shading for the preview and you can see what that looks like easily. So now that we have that, because this doesn't look great, we're going to change it around a little bit. Let's go to the shading tab. We can again press 1 on the keyboard so we can see, and the numpad period will quickly zoom us in. Come down here so you can see your nodes. You can also drag this up since our model is fairly small. I'm going to come up here to my render properties. I'm going to switch this from EV to cycles. If your computer supports it, change it to GPU, which renders a little faster. I only want 15 max samples for both the viewport and the render. That'll make my final render a bit faster. Off to the left here, we want to press Shift and A, then search for a color ramp. Click on the right handle, you'll know if you did if it turns to white, and then just drag and drop this color in there to get started. So we're going to bring the edges in just a touch. I'm going to add a new handle somewhere over here and make this something a little more orange. You'll have to connect the color to the color to start seeing any of that. You also need to change from viewport to render. And one more thing that we can do is come down here in the render properties. Come down here to film and make sure that that is set to transparent just to get rid of that background. So we can add another handle, setting this one to something in that range. I'm going to bring the strength up so it's brighter. And I'm also going to change the emission from surface to volume, which changes the way that looks quite a bit. We can add another one in here. I'm going to add somewhere in that range. And then I also want to press Shift and A, search for a noise texture. Drop that over here. Plug the factor into the factor. We can change the detail so it comes all the way up. Roughness, we can play around with that. You'll see some minor changes coming in. Distortion, you can play around with that. And scale, you can play around with that as well. So a lot of this is going to be personal preference. If you're not seeing enough detail, what you can do is come back to your texture properties and play around with the scale a bit. And so you'll get some variations. I kind of like that one. So that's 0.5 on mine. And just play around with these until you have something that you like and you're ready to bring into your project. I think I'm going to settle on that. Next, what we want to do is come back to the Layout tab. And this looks wonky because you have to switch over to the render preview in order to see that. I'm going to set my preview somewhere around there. Press Ctrl Alt and numpad 0. Once you have that set, you can press F12 on the keyboard. Let that render. You see that mine's rendering pretty fast because it was only 15 samples. Once you have that, come up here to Image, Save As, and I'm just going to save mine to my desktop. And I'll name this as Muzzle Flash. And we want to tick this RGB instead of the RGBA, just because It'll export in a way that you can use it. Click this Save As, and next let's head back to gDevelop. Next, I want to reorder my animations so that idle is first, walk is second, and shoot will be last, and I want to disable the loop on shoot. So you may or may not need to do this in your project. It depends on how you brought your GLB file in with the animations. Once that's done, click Apply on that. Next, we're going to create some crosshairs for our scene. Click here on Add a New Object. We want a new 3D box. Rename this as Crosshairs. We can leave the default 100 cubed, enable transparency, and we only want this front face, so let's disable these other faces just to make sure we don't forget. Now let's go into Create with Pascal. Change the color to white. Come into Preferences, Tile Mode, disable this tile mode, and we can collapse that. Now you can zoom out so you can see. And we want the vertical mirror pin. So crosshairs will be personal preference. If I come into 14 by 14 and hold down the Shift key, we can do something like that, which will just be a sort of an X on the screen. That'll be one option. We can come to 13 by 13, also hold the Shift and do something like that. Alternatively, we could do a circle in the center. Let's come into 13 by 13, left click and hold, and we're going to come out to the 19 by 19. Come up here to New. We'll call this Crosshairs, and click Save on that. Once you have that, click Apply. Now that we have that, you could drag it into your scene, but I'm going to use an event for mine, so let's click on the Events tab. At the floor setup, we're going to create a new event group and just call this Blaster. And then I want to create another event group just below that. Make sure that's nested, and I'm going to call this Crosshairs. So what I want to do at the Crosshairs is go ahead and generate an event. Make sure that's appropriately nested, and we want at the beginning of the scene. Click OK on that, and at the beginning of the scene, we're going to create an object. The X position is going to be screen width divided by 2 minus the crosshairs width divided by 2, and the Y position will be screen height divided by 2 minus the crosshairs height divided by 2, and we want to put that on the UI layer. So click OK on that, and we should be able to preview and see our crosshairs now. And regardless of the screen size, that will be in the center of our screen. Next, I'm going to move my blaster from the screen so that it's generated by an event. And the reason I want to do that is so I don't accidentally move or resize the event. So I'm going to take a moment here and grab my X, Y, Z as well as my rotation. I'm also going to rotate my blaster slightly so that it's pointing towards the center, and I'm going to move it closer to the center, but I don't want it to be exactly centered. Pause the video here. Take a moment to put your blaster where you want it and make a notation of the XYZ positions as well as the XYZ rotations. Once you have that, resume the video. Once you have all of your values, you can go ahead and delete the blaster from your scene. Now I'm going to head over to the Events tab. If you click on the crosshairs, we'll add a new event group. And that brings that into the correct location, and we're just going to label this as Generate. From there, let's go ahead and add an event and make sure that that is nested appropriately. For this one, we want at the beginning of the scene, so you can just copy this or navigate to it, whichever works for you. And then at the beginning of the scene, I'm going to, for the blaster, create the object. The X and Y positions will be the notations that you just made. If your project matches mine, it'll be 450 for the X and 530 for the Y, and we want to make sure that we put this on the UI layer. We also want to add in the rotation, so let's go ahead and add a new action. For the blaster, we want to change the rotation, and we want to start with the rotation on the X-axis, and we're going to set that. If your project matches mine, I'm doing value of -10. We also want to rotate on the Y. So rotate on the y-axis, and mine will be the value of 5. So at the beginning of the scene, it should create that blaster where I wanted it. Next, I want to generate events for when our player is idle. So at the crosshairs, let's go ahead and add a new event group, label this as idle, then add a new event, and make sure that that is nested. I'm going to add an AND condition here. I want to make sure that all of these conditions are met. For the first condition, I want to grab this if the mouse pointer is locked. Let's go ahead and just bring that down and paste it in, or you can navigate to it, it's fine. For my second condition here, I want to check whether a button is held. I want this button pressed or touched held for the left mouse button, and I want to invert that. So if the left mouse button is not being pressed down and the mouse pointer is locked, I'm going to change the animation of the blaster, and I just want to call that by name and set it to idle. So if the player is not shooting, that will set them back to idle. Next, I want to set the appropriate animations for our walking events. So let's come up here to the camera movement, and if the W key is pressed, let's go ahead and change the animation for the blaster, and we want to call that by name as well, and we want to set that to walk. So now that we have that first one, we can go ahead and copy this all the way down for these 4 events. Next, let's head back to the Scene tab. Click here on Add a New Object. Scroll down until you see 3D Particle Emitter. Check these out in your spare time, but for now, let's skip and create from scratch. Let's rename this to Muzzle Flash. Change the emission duration to -1, flow of particles to 1, min and max span to 0.1. We want to change the end and beginning color to default 255 because we want to use our muzzle flash colors, leaving the opacity as default, changing the spray cone to 0. For the start, min, and max size, this will very much depend on the object that you created, so you may need to change these numbers to match your project. For my project, I'm going to start with 150 and end with 170. That will just give some variation. So you could set those 2 numbers the same. If you're not seeing a flash when you start your testing, come back and just increase these numbers until you see your flash, and then you know what you're working with. For the min and max speed, I don't want my flash to move, so I'm going to change both of those to 0. Next, we're going to add a sprite and bring in the muzzle flash so that you export it from your Blender project. Now click Apply. Next, we want to add a new layer. Rename this layer as Muzzle Flash and drop that down so it's below the UI. Next, let's head over to the Events tab. At the Crosshairs, let's go ahead, click there, and we want to add a new event group. We're going to name this Shoot and add a new event in, then make sure that that is nested. For the shoot, we want another AND condition. Click OK on that. For the first subcondition, we want to see if the mouse pointer is locked, so let's go ahead and just copy this one, or you can navigate to it. For the second condition, let's copy this touch event and paste that down here, then click J to make sure that we invert that. And we do want a trigger once here. For the first action, for the muzzle flash, we want to create an object. The X position is going to be blaster.centerX. For the Y position, we again want the blaster and center Y. I want to add this to the muzzle flash layer and then click OK on that. I also want to change the animation for the blaster. So animation, we want to set that to shoot and click OK on that. Now let's go ahead and test this. And this first test is just to get an idea of what we're working with. Currently, I can't see my muzzle flash anywhere. So I'm going to come out here and start messing with these numbers. For mine, I'm going to start with a +80. And for the Y, I'm going to do a -150. Let's preview that again. And now we can see our muzzle flash. Pause the video here and take a few moments to play around with the center X and center Y position to make sure that the muzzle flash is lined up with the front of your blaster. Now our muzzle flash is generally in the correct position, but I'm also noticing that our animation for the shoot is a little bit slow. So I'm going to come in here, add an action, and let's look for animation speed. I want this animation speed scale for the blaster, and I want to set the scale up to about 5. Let's see what that looks like. That looks better. Okay, so now we have a new problem in that it changed all of our animations. So what I want to do is copy this animation speed, and at the idle position, let's go ahead and set that back to a 1. This should correct our animation, and it does. So you can see that my muzzle flash, though, is still not in the right place. So the reason I'm showing you this part is that it very much depends on the muzzle flash size, the size of the blaster, and you have to manipulate these numbers here until it lines up. So I'm going to take a moment here and go ahead and do that. Pause the video, do the same in your project, and I'll meet you back here in a second. That looks pretty good for mine. And I'm going to do one more thing here. Let's add an action. We want to play a sound. And I'm going to come up here to the Create with JFXR. Be sure to check out the contributions. Play around with this, get a sound that you like, and I'll meet you back here in a second. Once you're happy with the sound, let's go ahead and rename this to Shoot, and click Save on that. So once we have that, we're going to set the volume all the way up to 100. For the pitch and speed, in order to get variations in your game, use the random float in range. For my float, I'm going to do 0.5 and 0.7. We'll see what that sounds like. Click OK on that. Do a quick play test. Mine's a little loud, so I'm going to set the volume back to 80. I'm also going to change the shoot animation back to a 5, see what that looks like. One thing I notice here is that when I'm walking or moving, the animation's not lining up. So for now, what I'm going to do is go up and copy my keys, and I want to make sure that if we're shooting, and I'm going to press J to invert that. I'm just going to make sure that the keys are not pressed and test that again. I also want to make sure that I set the animation back to 1 for each of these. So now if I'm walking, it's a normal rotation. I can shoot, but I can't shoot and walk at the same time, and I can still duck. We made a lot of changes. Be sure to save your project. We've made a lot of changes and covered a lot of material in this segment. Make sure that you've saved your project. Be sure to click on the like and subscribe, which supports my channel and lets me know how I'm doing. In the next segment, we're going to work on creating, animating, and exploding our targets. I hope this helps, and we'll see you next time.